We live in a world where there appears to be a great deal of suffering. We don't have to look very far to see great suffering. And there are many causes. There are large-scale external environmental sources. There are plenty of wars and insurrections that cause vast suffering. There are oppressive, exploitive, and incompetent governments that cause all of their citizens to suffer greatly. But even in apparently stable environments, there are plenty of what I'll call small-scale external sources of suffering. Poverty, abusive relationships, and things like that. And even when the external environment is okay, there is still much suffering to be endured. These internal causes are anxieties, fears, beliefs about how the world is. So the world appears, especially if we look at the news, to consist of a great deal of suffering. But there have always been a few people who seem to be serene. They have problems in their lives, but they seem to get through them without undue suffering. Now, some people are just like that. They didn't do anything special. They just grew up and turned out to be serene and content. There are not very many people like that. There are things one can do to learn to be serene. And these are mainly Eastern spiritual practices. Things like meditation and mindfulness, awareness and acceptance. And in these Eastern spiritual practices, they have a name for this kind of attitude. They call it being whole. And being whole is described as a very desirable way to be. It leads, apparently, to feeling good, to minimizing the amount of suffering that it takes to get through a life. Now, also in these Eastern spiritual practices, there is another different but related term, and that is non-duality. So the solution to suffering, as proposed by the Eastern spiritual practices, is to be whole and non-dual. So, why do people suffer? Because they are not whole. They are fragmented. They are fragmented in their worldview. And because they view the world in a fragmented way, it causes them to suffer when things happen. So, if being whole is good and being fragmented is bad, and there are lots of people suffering, they are all presumably being fragmented. Why would anyone become fragmented? Why would they do that? Why would so many people become fragmented? Well, there's a reason. And the reason is that there are a great many authority figures in many cultures that actively promote a fragmented worldview. Now, a fragmented worldview is, I believe, a contributor to the suffering that we see in the world. It is not the only source, and we'll talk about some other ones a little later. But let's consider, for the moment, a very common set of fragmented worldviews. So when we talk about viewing the world, we need to understand that there is a basic assumption that everybody makes. And it's not a bad assumption. The idea is that I, whoever that is, am separate from my environment. I am in here. I live inside my body somehow, inside my head or whatever it is. But I am an observer, and I live in here. This is something that we learn pretty early in life. If I can believe my Google search, recognizing that we are a separate being in the world occurs at about 15 months. And after that, we go through our lives believing that we are in here looking out at what we assume to be reality. So I am in here and reality is out there. And we depend on our ability to observe what's out there, to get through our lives, to avoid bumping into things, to decide what to do, to decide how to react to a situation. So we like to think that what's out there is rather fixed. But if you talk to different people about what's out there, you will get a variety of different views. What's out there seems to be variable depending on who you talk to. So in my readings and conversations with people, it appears to me that there are three domains that make up the reality out there. Now, everybody doesn't agree on these domains, but these three domains seem to be able to account for most of the views that we see in the world. So, the first and most common domain is the material domain. And in fact, everybody does a pretty good job of agreeing on the material domain. Almost nobody walks into a chair sitting in the middle of the room. Even blind people do a pretty good job of avoiding bumping into things. And we seem to agree pretty widely on the presence or absence of things in the material world. So I've drawn my little picture here with me over here above the material world. We have the very common experience that our bodies, the place where we live, the thing that carries our in here, is material. And indeed, our bodies interact all the time with the material world. If we don't see the chair in the middle of the room and walk into it, it hurts. So our bodies appear to be part of the material world. Now, the material world is local. Things have a place. The material world is made of matter. That's what we bump into. There is time in the material world. Things happen in sequence, one event before the other. There is space. There is distance between places. There is distance between pieces of matter. My car is in the parking lot at the end of the block. I am in the store at the other end of the block. So, the material world is a big part of most worldviews. There are two other domains that make up worldviews. The next one is usually called spiritual. Now, this one is more controversial and much more varied. There are a great many views of what the spiritual world is, and there is even considerable disagreement about the existence of the spiritual world. But there are a lot of believers in the spiritual world. There always have been, and so I include it here as part of the general worldview. Now, the spiritual side is, in almost everybody's view, non-material. There is no matter on the spiritual side. Spiritual side is usually viewed as transcendent, that is, transcending space and time. There is no notion of space or time in the spiritual world. Now, the spiritual world is where God, among other things, live, and God is, in most all formulations, conscious, and God is intelligent. So the characteristics of the spiritual world are a non-material, transcendent intelligence. Now, there's one more rather small domain of reality that I think is important to include, even though it is not very popular with anybody. And this is usually called the paranormal. Even the name tells you what most people think of it. Paranormal, outside the normal. And paranormal includes all the knowing and action at a distance phenomena. Psychics, remote viewers, medical intuitives, energy healers, and things like that. The paranormal is not usually considered to be a spiritual practice. God is not invoked in most paranormal practices. But the paranormal I can characterize as the interaction between the transcendent and the material worlds. Now, the paranormal has a rather small following. A great many people who are advocates of the material world think that the paranormal is a hoax. A lot of the spiritual people don't like the paranormal, I gather because they don't invoke God. So there are the three domains that make up collectively the common worldviews. And this worldview, these worldviews, are basically fragmented, the way most people interpret them. To begin with, I am not part of the out there. I am in here. I am an observer. I am separate from uh, even the material world, but I am certainly separate from the spiritual world. In most views, the material world and the spiritual world are quite separate, not related very much at all. There are those who think that the spiritual world is very important and they minimize the importance of the material world. So this is the source of the worldviews that many people learn. So they learn a fragmented way of being. Now, as I mentioned before, a fragmented worldview is not the only source of suffering, but it does contribute. And so I would like to propose that if we had a whole worldview, that it might help us all become whole. So I would like to describe a whole worldview next.